So thank you all so much for joining us. Best-selling author Nancy Johnson will discuss her new novel, People of Means, in conversation with author Julie Carrick Dalton in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So a little bit about Julie. Julie is a Boston-based author of The Last Beekeeper and Waiting for the Night Song, named a most anticipated novel by CNN, Newsweek, USA Today, Parade, and many others, and an Amazon editor's pick for best books of the month. Let's see, a Bread Loaf, Tin House, and Grub Street novel incubator alum. Julie is a frequent speaker on the topic of fiction in the age of climate crisis at universities, conferences, museums, and libraries. Her writing has appeared in Chicago Review of Books, Orion, Newsweek, the Boston Globe, Electric Literature, LitHub, and many other publications. When she isn't writing, you can usually find Julie digging in her garden, skiing, kayaking, or walking her dogs. And just a little bit about Nancy. Let's see here, a native of Chicago's South Side, Nancy Johnson worked for more than a decade as an Emmy-nominated, award-winning television journalist at CBS and ABC affiliates nationwide. A graduate of Northwestern University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, she lives in downtown Chicago and manages brand communications for a large nonprofit. And her first book, The Kindest Lie, was a Book of the Month Club selection and a Target Book Club pick. So with all that said, folks, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Nancy and Julie for joining us here tonight. And Julie, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. I'm so excited to be here as a Boston resident. This means a lot to me to be introducing Nancy to my state, on all the librarians. So Nancy and I have a long-standing friendship. She is my literary soulmate, my literary bestie. So it just means so much to me that you invited me to be here with you today, Nancy. So thank you.
Of course, of course. I wouldn't have asked anyone else. And then it was just so perfect when I found out that this was Massachusetts Libraries and you're a local Massachusetts author. It was just perfect. So,
So I know that I'm dying to talk about People of Means because one of the fun things for me tonight is Nancy and I have not talked about the book yet since I read it. And we talk a lot. We probably talk on the phone a couple times a week, but we have not talked about the book yet. But before we get into it, I thought it'd be fun since this is a library event, just to get a little snippet. I'd love to know what your relationship to libraries was when you were a kid. Were you one? I'm envisioning as one of those girls who hung out in libraries with a big stack of books. Am I right?
Yes, you were absolutely right. I know you were that as well. And I know we've talked about the fact that we probably would have been hanging out at libraries together as little girls. I think if we had known each other back then. But certainly, so as I mentioned in the chat, I'm from Chicago, from the South Side. And in Chicago and in many cities, particularly inner cities, you often have a street named after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in Chicago, it's King Drive. And throughout the country, when people think about those streets associated with the name King, they usually think about crime, violence, impoverished people, all of that. But for me, King Drive, holds a special place in my heart because there was this one beacon of light and brilliance right there on King Drive, and that was the King Branch Library on 35th and King Drive. And I would go there well, not every day, but quite a few days during the week, and then certainly on Saturdays with my mom. And then I would leave there with this huge armful of books, so it was such a special time for me to connect with librarians and to connect with libraries. And so it's a special relationship, and I'm just, honored to be here with the library community tonight.
Yeah, thank you to all the librarians out there. We authors really appreciate you and the fact that you raised us, and now you are housing our books. So we are
They're some of our biggest champions.
Really. Yeah. So we're both very grateful. Okay, so now about the book, People of Means. So for the people who haven't read it yet, do you want to tell us just a little bit about what the book's about? No spoilers, of course.
Sure. And I also wanted to just mention that a point of pride is that my book has been featured in Women's World magazine.
Ooh, nice.
So exciting. also in Real Simple magazine
Look at
as
you.
well. I know, this is so fun. And then just picked this copy up today in People magazine. It was featured. So that has been just so much fun because my book just launched February 11th. So I'm still in my launch week activities and going around trying to find the book in all these consumer magazines. But the story, People of Means, is about an upper middle class Black mother and daughter, both of them coming of age at different moments of racial and social reckoning in America. The mother, Freda, is a student at Fisk University in the late 1950s, early 60s, at the time of the sit-ins, and she's coming from Chicago. And so the indignities of the Jim Crow South are very new to her. And then 3 decades later, her daughter Tulip is coming of age in 1992 in Chicago at the time of the acquittal of those officers for the beating of Rodney King. So both of them in these really pivotal moments. And it's really a story of these two incredibly strong women trying to balance this pursuit of justice with their own personal ambitions. And so it's a story that I know People magazine called it, what do they say, an evocative story of love and sacrifice. And I think that's just a perfect way to encapsulate what the book is about.
So I'm curious what inspired you to choose these two moments in history, like when you were looking at these two specific characters.
Yeah. So it's really about looking at my inspiration for the story itself. And I was inspired by the events of the summer of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. And I saw so many people being sparked to activism from all over the world, from every walk of life. And so that was riveting to me. And then a few months after the murder of George Floyd, Representative John Lewis died. And for me, he has just always been this larger than life civil rights icon, this older gentleman that I've revered my entire life. But then when he died, I watched a documentary about his life. And in that documentary, they talked about him being this student, 19 years old. He spent some of his time on the campus of Fisk University. And here he was, college student. And, he would have been working on his, thinking about his syllabus, getting his class schedule together, studying, making friends, dating, doing all the normal things that we do as college students. But yet he was organizing those lunch counter sit-ins that really launched the civil rights movement. And I kept thinking, what would that have been like to be a young person at that moment in time when you weren't really prepared formally for this, but you were thrust into this moment in history. And then what do you do with that? And so that's how the character of Freda was born. And that's why the time period of the late 50s, early 60s, because I was thinking about that time with the lunch counter sit-ins. And then the other timeline is 1992, Chicago, around the time of that Rodney King case. And that's very personal to me also because of the fact that I was a student at Northwestern University in 1992 at that time. And that was my first real taste of activism. And I was out there with my picket sign and chanting, no justice, no peace, no justice, no peace, right? And so many of my classmates got involved in those protests. And so I kept thinking about that time period too. But I know that for me as a student doing that, there was not a lot of risk involved in me engaging in that way because I was on a campus where so many people were, engaging in activism. And you know how it is.
Yeah.
Many college campuses can be a hotbed of activism and, throughout history. But I wanted my character Tulip, the woman in the 1992 storyline, I wanted to have her be a public relations professional. So in her first job, real job outside of after college, because then the stakes are higher
Yeah.
in terms of how involved she could get. What are the ramifications for her professionally? So that's why those two time periods. And then I just love a mother-daughter relationship. I think mothers and daughters that relationship can be so incredibly fraught. And, and I think that I know I'm not a mother, but I'm a daughter. And I know that I still live to this day under the, expectations that my mother has for me. I'm always trying to live up to what she wants me to be in the world.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue into my next question was you talk a lot in this book about this concept of Black excellence and how Black excellence plays a significant role in Freda's upbringing in particular. So how do you think this ideal influences Freda and Tulip's decisions throughout the story? And as a follow-up, has the ideal of Black excellence shaped you? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. And that's why I wanted to write about it, because I certainly feel the weight of Black excellence. And so it's really about, when we see the Barack Obamas and we see, the Misty Copelands and ballet and all the different Black people who are doing great things in the world, as a Black person, we hold them up as an ideal. This is our Black excellence. And I think a lot of how we think about Black excellence is rooted in the racism and the discrimination in the country, because there are so few positive representations of Blackness that we see in media. Many of the depictions of what it means to be Black in media, whether it's books or movies or TV shows, we see so many negative images. So that's something that's always very personal for me and important and intentional for me as an author. When I'm thinking about crafting a story, I'm thinking about how am I going to portray my community.
Mhm.
That's very important. So that was one reason for having Freda be a mathematician.
Mhm.
In my first novel, The Kindest Lie, Ruth Tuttle, my main character, was a chemical engineer. We
Yeah.
don't see a lot of representations of Black people in STEM fields, certainly not Black women in math and science. And so that was important for me. But at the same time, I don't want to be held hostage by this idea of Black excellence and this pressure to portray my characters in a certain light, because we as Black people are not a monolith, right? So we are very multidimensional and we are complex. And I want to show the full range of humanity, of who Black people are, what it means to be Black in America. So that's why you see such a range of characters. But getting back to the story with Black excellence, Freda, the young woman in the 1950s, 60s storyline, she comes to Fisk with, again, the weight of expectation about Black excellence. It's coming from her parents. Both of her parents matriculated from Fisk University. Her father also went to and graduated from Meharry Medical College, which is right there near Fisk, just a few steps away. And so she's coming there with this, just steeped in all of this tradition. They've talked to her about Jubilee Hall and that it was named after the famous Jubilee singers, right, who traveled all over Europe raising money for the college. And so there's so much history and so much that is on her shoulders that she's carrying with her, that she really almost feels it as a physical weight on her when she arrives on that campus from Chicago. The movement is getting started, but her parents are very clear. Her parents are back home in Chicago, but when they talk on the phone on Sunday nights,
Mhm.
when those rates are cheaper, they are
Mhm.
always talking to her about, we don't want you to get sullied by activism, by the movement. We know there are going to be some people getting involved and all that around you. You don't do that. You focus on your studies. We sent you there to get that education and to be excellent. And that is how you resist. And so that's in the back of her mind, or really in the forefront of her mind, throughout her time there at Fisk. And it's really um, has a big impact on the choices that she makes about whether or not she's going to get involved in activism.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about the book is the way Freda and Tulip each are struggling with this tension between their own personal ambition and getting involved in activism and social justice. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because to me, that was one of the most compelling parts of the story is like I wanted them to have all the success they dreamed of. And I wanted them to get involved in the political activism, but it felt like they couldn't do both. And there's this constant tension, which really pulls the reader through the book, which I thought you did like beautifully. Can you tell me a little bit about how you did that, your intentionality
Yeah,
there?
there definitely was tension, and I was intentional about
Mhm.
creating that sense of tension. And I'll start with Freda, so she's feeling this tension. Like I said, she's got the expectations of her parents that she's just going to focus on studies, not get involved in activism. But she's in a new world. You know what it's like when you go off to college. You're no longer in your parents' house anymore, right? You're not under their rules per se. And so you have all of this freedom now to make your own decisions and to engage the way you want to, and you're exposed to so many new experiences. One thing, unfortunately, she's exposed to the indignities of the Jim Crow South. You know, she sees the colored and white restroom signs, and that's not something that she had ever seen in person. That was something she only saw in the news, and she thought that happened in some small godforsaken towns, but not in Nashville, right? And
Yeah.
certainly not anywhere near this esteemed campus she was a part of. But then I created, when I talk about the intentionality of how to create this tension, I created the characters of Darius and Gerald. So those are her two love interests.
I
And there's,
love
you love them. I
I
know,
did,
I
yeah.
love them too. Thank you for loving them. So these young men are her love interests, and there's this love triangle. You know, Darius is this saxophone playing budding activist, and Gerald is this ambitious student at Meharry Medical College. And so they are pulling her in two very different directions when it comes to activism. And so that's where some of the tension lies. It's about whether she's going to choose activism or not, but also who is she going to choose as her love, right? And those choices are very interconnected, the activism and the love stories and who she chooses to be with. And then in 1992, we have Tulip, who is dealing with very similar tensions that her mother dealt with 3 decades prior. Tulip is, like I said, a public relations professional, and you know she's still early in her career. And this Rodney King verdict comes down, and she is incensed. You know, she has this immediate need to do something, but she doesn't know what to do. But then she also is thinking about, I'm on this job, and my parents have sacrificed and they've done a lot of things to get me this opportunity. And I don't want to mess that up. They don't want me to mess that up. They've given me a mandate, just like Freda's parents gave her a mandate. Freda gives a mandate to her daughter too, that, you know, you need to do the right thing, and you need to, you know, prove yourself and work hard. And, you know, there's no reason to get involved in this, right? So two women, mother, daughter, decades apart, they are dealing with very similar tensions. And then Tulip also has a love interest, a young man named Key, short for Keyshawn, and he is a city bus driver. So I've got the class tension there, with her coming from this upper middle class background, and then Key from more of a working class background. And they have very different ideas about activism. You know,
Yeah.
Tulip is really toying with the idea of, you know, maybe I want to get involved in it. And Key is very, you know, much adamant and saying, no, no, you know, and it's interesting because he is saying you have the privilege, right,
Yeah.
of being able to make this kind of a call and go play as an activist, you know, after work if you want to. I don't. I've got to make a living as a bus driver. I've got parents, you know, his father formerly incarcerated. His mother was a hairnet at lunch lady. Both of his parents are now starting a new business. They're entrepreneurs now. They can't afford to get involved in this, is what he's saying, right? We're just trying to make it day to day, but that's part of your privilege to that you can engage in this way. And so, again, like I say, we're not a monolith as Black folks. So you've got this working class Black man making that choice. I'm talking about Key. Then you look at Darius, who comes from a sharecropping family in the 50s and 60s storyline, and he's all about the activism, right? So yeah, you can't always peg where somebody is going to fall in this, and there's no right or wrong answer about how to engage or whether to engage at all.
I thought you did a really nice job with all three of those men, in that I was very sympathetic and rooting for all three of them. And that they were complex and different from each other. And especially in the 50s, 60s timeline with Freda, the love triangle, like I wanted her to have both of them. Like I
I
wanted,
know, right?
like,
Like
yeah,
you have both men, and
yeah,
another
there's
book, maybe,
yeah, another book.
you
That'd be your
have
next book. I will definitely
both
buy
of
that
them,
one.
right?
But I really admired how the tension we talked about between the personal ambition and the activism part, and the tension between like who she's going to pick. There's several points in the book where I was like, how is Nancy going to like resolve this? Like, there's no way. Like I want them to have everything. Like I wanted the characters to get their personal ambitions, to be the activists, to have both men. Like I wanted all of it for your characters, and I just didn't see how you were going to pull this off in the end, that I was going to be satisfied as a reader, and you totally did.
Were you
Like
satisfied?
you threaded that needle for me, and
Okay,
I
good.
felt you did justice to these characters, but not in ways I didn't know the ending. Like it wasn't one of those books where I was reading where I knew how it was going to end, but I felt I put the book down like, yes, that was the right note to end on. I feel like I'm
And that's
dancing here.
something
I don't
you
want
and
to
I,
give an
no, that's something that you and I have talked about a bit too in writing books. How do you resolve a story? How do you end? How do you stick the landing, really? I
yeah,
thought it like gymnastics with sticking the
yeah,
landing.
yeah,
And I think what was really important to me in this book was not to tie up all the loose ends in a, tidy
right.
bow. I never like to do that. Excuse me. I never like to do that with books I'm writing, but I wanted the ending to feel inevitable in many ways,
Yeah,
that this is the way it had to be.
yeah,
Based on the choices that all the different characters made, this is where they ended up. And then I also like to end a book on a hopeful note.
yeah.
I think there was a sense of hope there.
No, I
You
think
don't
so
know how
too.
everything is going to turn out in the future for these characters, but I think you feel hopeful that they're going to find their way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it wasn't an ending that seemed obvious, but by the time I got to the end, you're right, it did seem like that was the only way, but I didn't see exactly how you're going to end it. So I thought that was like
I
nicely
love the way
done.
you're teasing that for me.
I know, I'm trying to not
Yeah,
give away any
right,
spoilers.
without giving away
I'm going
spoilers.
to call
There's a
you when
lot
we're
of twists
done.
and turns, and
Yeah.
so hopefully
Yeah,
people will read the book, and please like write to me and let me know what you think about the story and
yeah.
how. Yeah, like I love just talking. You and I both do love talking to readers about what they think of it and experiencing the book through the eyes of the reader.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also very relevant now. The story, I mean, it's two historical moments, but it's so relevant right this minute. How do you see like the challenges that Frida and Tulip were facing and their particular time periods reflected in today's social and racial climate?
Yep, yep, definitely very timely. It's like both books that I've written, I
Yeah.
had no idea, when they would come out into the world and what would be, more importantly, what would be happening in the world when the books would be released. So it's very, what I like to say, timely and timeless. To
Yeah.
answer the question, I want to go back in time to the 1860s. So after the Civil War, we had the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people, and then the 15th Amendment, which gave the franchise to Black men, the right to vote. And once they got the right to vote, you saw all of these Black men serving in political office in the South, even.
Yeah.
So, and then you look at this through line of history and you go a century later and you've got the civil rights movement and you've got Freda in that movement and John Lewis and the rest of them fighting to regain
Mhm.
these rights that they had already won back
Yeah.
then, right?
And here
Um,
we are now.
and here
Yeah.
we are now, right? And um, with the environment that we are in, with democracy being at stake, with the rollback of DE&I, rollback of civil rights and human rights, it's a really tough time. With the banning of books, which is quite
Yeah.
appropriate to this conversation. So much is a repeat of what we've been through. And I don't remember the exact quote, but Coretta Scott King talks about how every generation has to fight to regain the rights that they had won
Mm.
a generation prior, right? And so
Yeah.
it's really sad that we have to do that. But the one thing that I will say is we have a blueprint from history for how to do it, how to
Yeah.
resist. And when you talk about today, I don't know if you've seen this, Julie, in your social media feed, but Target the store, rollback DE&I
Yeah, I
program.
saw that.
And so right now in social media, the past, I don't know, few weeks, there has been this huge debate about, particularly in the Black community, about how do we resist this. And there are some people who are calling for full stage boycotts of Target
Yep.
because of
Yep.
it. However, Target had always been that one store that was really good about showcasing Black owned businesses. So
Hmm.
you have Tabitha Brown, the Lip Bar, a lot of these many Black owned businesses that have shelf space in Target. So then you have another contingent in social media saying, if we do a full scale boycott, we're going to hurt these Black owned businesses. And
Yeah.
that's not right either. And then you got folks on the other side saying, well, when they did the Montgomery bus boycott, they didn't say, well, some of us are going to, stay off the bus, but others of us are going to ride for certain circumstances. But okay, someone is asking me about what happened at Target. Yeah, so in January, Target just made the decision to roll back some of its DE&I efforts. I know part of that was Target had made a commitment, I think after the summer of 2020, to report how it was doing on certain, human rights and certain civil rights and certain issues that they were engaging in, how they were doing with their hiring of executives, diversifying their executive slate, those kinds of things. So they just rolled a lot of that back. They're no longer going to report their progress on their DE&I plan that they had put into place. So that was a big part of it. And so because of that, folks are saying we need to be very careful about where we spend our dollars. And do we want to spend our dollars in stores that are not going to have our best interests at heart and not really support us as a community? And so that's why you're seeing some of the boycotts. So yeah, like I said, people are comparing it to the Montgomery bus boycott and all that. So I just think it's a fascinating case study right now in terms of people debating what's the right way to resist, just like they debated in the 60s and the 90s.
And in your book, and towards the end of the book, and I'm gonna weave this through without giving anything away, but there's a conversation about that different ways of being an activist, and it doesn't always look the same. And one of the characters in the end is talking about what his role had been, and it was the women see it differently in the end because it's not the same for everybody, and there's so many different considerations, and it's not a one action for everyone.
Not. And when you think about the civil rights movement, I think there's this misnomer that everybody who was Black in particular was out there with the picket sign, marching and organizing and engaged in activism. And that just was not the case. There were people who did not participate. For one thing, it was extremely dangerous
Yeah.
work, right? Your life was at risk, everything was on the line for you to engage in that work. And so not everyone had the stomach for it. So that was one component of it. And then on the other hand, you had some people who, like Freda's parents, who said, there are other ways, excuse me, there are other ways to engage in resistance, right? And like I said, by being excellent in your studies, by going on and getting a great job, becoming a medical doctor, becoming
Yeah.
an attorney, going and doing that. And that argument among some of those Black folks was that's how you lift your community, by being great, by doing well, and then
Yeah.
when you do well, you know, everybody else rises with you, right? Rising tide lifts all boats is that particular thought. And then the other reason that some people didn't want to engage was that not in the streets kind of grassroots activism, because they felt that we have the organizations in place to do that. Freda's parents were often saying, we've got the NAACP, we've got the Urban League, right? We have those Black legacy organizations that can take care of this for us, right?
Right.
You don't have to be the one out there on the front lines. So
Yeah, no, well, thank you for this conversation. This is like, I feel like I need to call you when we're finished so we can keep on going. I'm going to get to some other questions, but this
yeah.
is,
I'm going to add one more thing in about Tulip, though, when you
oh
ask
yeah.
about activism, because I haven't said a lot about Tulip. So she decides to go engage with a housing project in Chicago
Mm.
called the Ida B. Wells homes. And so she goes there and meets people, and they're doing some grassroots activism after the Rodney King verdict. But even when she goes there, there's that class conflict, right? Because they're like, why are you coming here to the hood? Are you here slumming? What are you doing here playing activist, in our community? So they wanted to be able to handle their own resistance themselves. So again, that's part of the conflict about how we think about that. And then Tulip has some tools in her arsenal to resist that Freda didn't, because Tulip now is working in public relations. She has ties to news media. That's not something that Freda and how her counterparts had access to in the 50s and 60s. So I think the way we resist certainly changes in time, also technology, right?
Yeah.
Because the Rodney King case, which is featured prominently in the book, that was our first time having that camcorder video, as grainy as it was, but we saw what those officers were doing to Rodney King. And that's why that case got such national attention, even though the verdict turned out the way it did. And then all these years later to 2020, and we had cell phone video of George Floyd and that white officer, kneeling on the neck of George Floyd for more than 9 minutes. That's what sparked so many people to activism, because they were sitting there watching that for over 9 minutes. And you can't turn away from something that barbaric. You just can't.
Yeah, I mean, in a different element of technology, it harkens back to the Till case, with the image of
Yes,
this
with
child
Richard.
in a this the his how his mother wanted the world to see his beaten face in the same way that we saw.
Catholic funeral. And I talk
Yeah,
about that in this novel too. You'll learn some things about Emmett Till that you may not have known about, and how his mother worked that out to make sure that, what she said was, I want the world to see what
yeah,
they
yeah.
did.
Yeah. So something else that kind of changing topics a little bit, but something that really intrigued me in your book was music. That there
Yeah.
was a lot of music in both timelines, but in particular in the 50s and 60s timeline, music and activism intersect in Freda's storyline in this like really dynamic way. And I'm just kind of curious how you think about what role do you think that art plays in driving social change historically and today? Because
Oh,
that was a
yeah.
really fascinating because you brought real people into real musicians,
I did bring real
stories.
musicians.
Yeah.
You get to meet some real musicians, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that you get to meet Nat King Cole.
Yes.
There you get to hear his music, and he definitely plays a prominent role, and he has a speaking role, and he performs in the book as well. So I loved being able to kind of bring him back to life, right?
Yeah.
And the music scene, I spoke with a gentleman about the music scene in Nashville as part of my research for this book, and it was huge. And well, we know Nashville is just known for music,
Yeah.
period. It always has been, and still to this day is known for music. But there was a street then called Jefferson Street, and Jefferson Street was where you had all of the nightclubs and the music venues. And so it was nothing to hear Jimi Hendrix perform, or Nat King Cole, and all of the greats that we know about now. So many of them would just come to Jefferson Street in Nashville and do these sets, and they would perform. And that was just a big part of the nightlife in the 50s and the 60s there in Nashville. And I think resistance started to work its way into the music. And so the lyrics and some of the songs, particularly as you move further along into the 1960s, you start to see how that idea of resistance was definitely something that was a part of the music, of that era. And I compare that to today, and I don't know how many people watch the Super Bowl halftime show, but
Mhm.
Kendrick Lamar, his performance was very much about resistance. And it's something that you may want to go back and watch and listen to again, and read some of the think pieces about Kendrick Lamar's performance. But just the formation of all of those Black people forming the American flag, and then he actually had a split in the flag, right? Showed some
Yeah.
of the divisions, but just to see Black bodies who built the country, and to see that be the embodiment of the American flag. That was just one of many, many pieces of symbolism in there. And, and he said at the end, turn the TV off, turn the TV off. And so there's a lot of symbolism to that too about how the revolution will not be televised. So
Mm.
there's just so much richness to how music is such a big part of the culture of resistance back then and still today.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. That was a very also a fun part. In your
Yes, it
story was
was.
seeing these little cameo moments, and Jesse Jackson has a little walk
Jesse
on.
Jackson has
Yeah,
a walk on. You'll have to see how. Yes.
yeah. I won't
Yeah.
tell, but it was
That
really
was a
it was.
fun scene for me, right? Yeah.
And a lot, those were all fun. It was very exciting to see these characters. So something that I haven't mentioned. We've talked a lot about these important themes and, social justice and racism and all these things. But I also really want to let, anybody out there who hasn't read it that is thinking about reading it it's a really great story too. Like the
Yeah, it's not just
characters.
a heavy book. Yeah.
No, it's not. It's a wonderful it's a really compulsive like read. Like it was propulsive, that's the word I meant. Read that I didn't want to, stop because the characters are engaging, the love triangle. And so you did
And
a
moments of
really
levity too. I
yeah,
wanted to get that in there.
absolutely.
So there was laughter, especially
Absolutely. And
Frida
friendship.
and her friendship. Yes, a lot of friendship. So Frida and her two girlfriends in college,
Yeah,
they
they were
were
fun.
cutting up and having a great time, having
Yeah.
so much fun. Tulip in 1992, she and her two friends, she's got a male
Yeah.
friend and a female friend who are part of her crew, and they are always, cutting up as well, having a
Yeah.
ball. And so, yeah, there's so much fun. And I think that's something else I wanted to show, that just because you're living in moments of consequence, and these are heavy moments in history, you're still human and you're still gonna want to hang out with your friends and laugh, and and there you have to find moments of joy amid
Yeah.
the pain and the difficulties of all of this that we are dealing with. And it's the same as now. Like, yeah, we're all dealing with how are we going to some of us who want to resist are dealing with how
Mhm.
we're going to resist now, but yet you're still living your life and you're still having fun and enjoying yourself, right? You have to. I don't think you
Yeah.
can get through the tough times and be able to be fully present as someone who is resisting and as an activist if you're not also taking care of yourself, right?
Yeah, and I appreciated that a lot about the book because I did learn things in the book, and you did give me a lot to think about. But you also gave me a lot of like joy and smiles and characters that I was like just liked them for who they were, not for what they were trying to accomplish. Just so I think that's it's sometimes some books feel like when you read it, the author's trying to teach you something. The author's trying to look in and teach you a lesson, and I didn't feel that from this book. I just enjoyed the book, but also when I'd put it down, I'd think about it a lot. So I think that was a
Yeah.
really excellent balance.
That's something I really try to be intentional about, is even though I'm, like you said, I'm dealing with some really, heavy issues, but I don't ever want to be didactic. Going back to the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, there were so many nonfiction books that came out, and I love nonfiction as well. And I thought they were very important books, so many about anti-racism, right?
Hmm.
But I think some of those books, people felt like, oh, I'm being preached to, or you're telling me how I should be, or you're labeling me, right, as a racist and all that. Whereas when you get lost in fiction and
Yeah.
story, it's such a great way to build empathy, and people can connect to that story, right? And they don't feel as threatened by it, and they're really able to ease into the story and walk in the shoes of somebody whose life is very different from their own. And it's just so much easier to do that through fiction.
Yeah. No, and I really appreciated that about this book. I think you like kind of walked that line very well. So I'm kind of curious about, when you were writing this novel and doing the research and talking to people and doing interviews, did it deepen your perspective or change the way you thought about the sacrifices that people made fighting for equality at different points in history?
It did. I mean, I really had to research the 50s, 60s storyline. I lived
Yeah,
through 1990s.
yeah, yeah,
So I had my own personal appreciation for that. But I don't think it even felt like a big deal that I did that marching. You know what I mean?
yeah,
It
yeah,
felt like,
yeah,
to be honest, like I don't want to put myself up on any pedestal and say, oh, yeah, I was an activist. No, I mean, but maybe I was in my own way, because I do want to make the point that, people can do this in large and small ways, right? So even if
yeah,
you go out there and you do something one time, that's, being an activist. But I think what I learned from the research, so one piece of research was interviewing Nikki Giovanni,
Mm,
great poet and author, Nikki Giovanni. And so I just wish she had lived to, be able to read my book. I would have loved to have
yeah.
read it. So that's a tough moment. But she gave me a real appreciation for what people were going through and what the sacrifices were like at the time, particularly for people who were more prominent, kind of what they had to deal with because you had to protect your livelihood.
Hmm.
Also, be engaged in this work too. So I learned a lot from her. I also interviewed students or people who were students. These women are now in their 80s and they were students at Fisk during that time period. And so I was able to interview them and get some of the details like, what did you wear to class? And,
Yeah.
they were able to tell me about wearing, pantyhose and skirts or dresses in certain professors' classes and curfew and all of that. But I think they also helped deepen my understanding about, again, the sacrifices that so many people had to make. One woman I interviewed who was a student at Fisk back then, she said that she said she grew up in a small town in Tennessee. And I kind of put this in the book a little bit. You'll see this in the book. But she grew up in a small town in Tennessee, and her parents were both teachers. And she said that it was really hard. She said, I snuck and did a little bit of activism, but I couldn't do much. She said, because my parents' jobs would be at risk.
Mm,
Their teaching jobs would be at risk if I got involved. And that's why I had to be very, very careful. And those were the kinds of things that, just reading books and watching movies about the civil rights movement that I really didn't think about the personal impact on people's lives
yeah.
and so that really struck me, and her story stuck with me quite a bit, hearing about
Yeah,
that.
I see Robert just put a note
Okay.
in there to remind everybody that we're going to have time for questions. I'm going to ask one more question of Nancy, but we would love to have questions from any of the viewers out there about Nancy's writing process, her publishing journey, any other questions about the books. But while you're thinking of your questions, I have one last question. So I loved your author's note at the end of the book.
Thank you.
I listened to it on audio and it was in your own voice. So it's like
Got to
listening to
voice
my
it,
friend.
y'all.
It was
Yeah,
great. And
but definitely check
the,
out the audio version of
it was
the
wonderful.
reading.
The narrator was great.
Bonnie Turpin was absolutely phenomenal, bringing the characters to life. And she also has some personal connections to the book that she didn't know about until she started voicing it. So that's a lot of fun. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt.
oh no. That's a really good. She did a fantastic job. The thing that really jumped out at me in your author's note was you talk about the title, about people of means. Now, before I read the book, I've been talking to Nancy about this book for 4 years, about, while she was developing the story and writing it. And I just took people of means as people of financial means. That's what I thought the book was about. And we start the book with these women who are from kind of upper middle class, financially secure families. So I'm like, okay, people of means, but you talk about how there's so much more to that. There's more to means. Means does not necessarily mean financial means. And I love the way you put it. So I'm not going to try to paraphrase you, but do you want to talk about that a
Yeah,
little
I'll
bit?
talk about that title. So, titles can be so tricky sometimes.
Yeah, yeah,
You never know if your title is going to stick, right? When you submit your title to the publisher,
yeah,
lucky both times with the kindest lie, and then this one, people of means, that no one questioned it. This title stuck, but I remember the first time I posted the title of the book and the description of the book, People of Means, in social media. And I had several Black folks, other authors, and just other people say, "Ooh, yeah, yeah, I like that." I think because the society at large doesn't always think of Black folks as being people of means, right? And I'm talking about the socioeconomic piece there.
yeah,
So for me, it was somewhat subversive. And hey, you know what? We are everywhere on the socioeconomic strata, right? There are Black folks who have wealth, and then there are ones who don't. So we are all over, the spectrum there. And so I felt it was kind of like when Tiare Jones did named her novel An American Marriage. And she
yeah,
said, like, do I have a right to call this marriage, of these two Black people and this story of incarceration an American marriage? But of course, it was a quintessentially American story, an American
yeah,
marriage. So, but then to also answer your question, there's a deeper meaning to people of means. People of means, it's not just the socioeconomic status, but it's also the capacity that we each have to make a difference in the world around us, in our own lives. If you have the capacity to love and to be a part of community, and if you follow your heart and live out your purpose, you too can be a person of means. And so that's something I want as a gift to the reader, to feel empowered that you indeed are people of means. It does not matter how much is in your bank account. You are still people of means.
I love that. And that feels like the perfect note to end on. And I think Robert has been fielding some questions for us. And thank you, Nancy, for
thank you for
being so generous with your questions.
So wonderful.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
So, folks, as Julie said, if you have any questions, now's the time to get them into the chat and into the Q&A. We have a few already. First, a comment from Donna. No question, but I really enjoyed listening to Nancy and finding out about this book. I'll be reading it and sharing it with my daughters. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Thanks for taking the time to be here.
And similar sentiments from Karen, who say, I can't wait to read this book.
Yay.
All right. So Sherry wants to know, how did your family give you the confidence to put your voice out there?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm an only child, very close to both of my parents. My father died in 2008 from lung cancer, but he and my mother been such great influences in my life. I would say my father in particular was always telling me, you're a Johnson girl, act like it, and so a lot of what I write about in the book about this idea of excellence and really believing that you come from good stock and that you have a rightful place in the world, a lot of that has come from my father. And I think that's where much of that confidence comes from. He died before I started writing novels, and so he didn't know I was going to do this. So of course I wish that he could be here and read my books. He'd be showing them to everybody. But yeah, both of my parents have given me the confidence to put my voice and my stories out into the world. I would say this story in particular, I dedicate it to my parents who met in a taxi cab, leaving a civil rights meeting. So they both were steeped in civil rights. And so they really gave me that passion for this kind of work as well.
Judy says, I enjoyed this conversation. I'm looking forward to reading both your books, and she thanks you.
Yes, and read Julie's books. Yes.
So Karen this is sort of like a three-part question. First question, what books are your favorites from your childhood? And Julie, feel free to chime in as well.
Okay, this is a good one. Julie always has really good answer to this one, but I'll start, then you can. So my childhood, I talked about going to the library so much as a kid. The one thing is I didn't always see myself reflected on the page in the books that I was reading. So that was a tough part. But I think at the time when I was a child, I didn't realize it. It wasn't until later that I realized I wasn't seeing myself reflected. So I was a big fan of Nancy Drew, my namesake. So I still, at my mother's place, I still have about, 60 plus Nancy Drew books. So that's what I was usually reading growing up, was Nancy Drew. I also read Beverly Cleary books. I read Judy Blume. So all those books that most young people, read. I read those particular books. So I read, what was another favorite of mine? Johnny Tremaine was something that I loved as a kid. So those were my favorites. I do remember finding a Black love story. So it was like the only book I found when I was growing up. It was called Ludell and Willie. And so it was, these two young Black folks I don't know if they were maybe in the 40s or the 50s, and they had a beautiful love story. It wasn't a romance book, but it was a true love story. And I just absolutely loved that book. So thanks for asking, because I think that's really what sparked my love for writing, I think, was that I was such an avid reader as a child.
Yeah, same with me. And I think my also was a Nancy Drew fan, and a big Little House on the Prairie fan. I loved those books. I used to wish I was Laura Ingalls when I was a kid, and I loved the Chronicles of Narnia. And Judy Blume, of course, I read all the Judy Blume books like over and over and over and over. I also was a big fan of anything with like a ghost story or a supernatural element. Like they didn't have Goosebumps, that story. I mean, that series out when I was a kid that I'm aware of. But if they had, I would have been all over that. I loved anything scary, anything. And I mean, I think all of that. I think my books that I write now are kind of a mashup of Laura Ingalls and Goosebumps. They're a little bit of a lot of nature and a little bit of speculative elements in them as well. So they do shape us. You know, those early stories that we read, they shape the people we become as well as the writers. I think both you and I have become.
Really do. That's a good way to put it. I think this was a three-parter, right, Robert?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to combine parts 2 and 3, but essentially how what Karen's asking is, what books are you reading now or hope to read in the future?
Okay, so I knew someone would ask me that. I was like, let me make a note of just a couple that I'm reading. So one thing, once you become a published author, particularly traditionally published, you get asked to blurb books quite a bit. And so right now I'm reading books for the purpose of blurbing. One of them is by Christine Pride, and it's entitled All the Men I've Loved Again. And it's about a love triangle that she was a part of, or that the character was a part of, many decades prior with two particular men. And then the decades later finds herself in the love triangle with the very same two men. And Christine Pride said it's based on her own life. She was in a love triangle decades apart with the same two men as well. So it's semi-autobiographical, apparently. So I'm enjoying that and reading it for a blurb that's due next month. Another book that I'm reading is, where is it? I feel like I've got it here. Oh boy, I just knocked on my big stack of paper, but that's okay. Love and Whiskey, which is nonfiction. And so it's by Fawn Weaver. And it's the story of Jack Daniel and his master distiller, Nearest Green, was a formerly enslaved Black man. And he was the one who taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey. And this is Fawn Weaver, Black woman owned business, and it's like valued at over $1 billion. And so
Wow.
I'm not a drinker, but I bought some Uncle Nearest whiskey because I believe in the brand, and I'm loving the storytelling in there. It's a brilliant book. My other favorite authors I will mention are, I love S.A. Cosby. He's a fan favorite of mine. And then also Dennis Lehane, crime fiction author, is a favorite. I love Terry Jones, who I've mentioned, Britt Bennett, some of those more contemporary writers, Jacqueline Woodson, Mary Beth Keane is a favorite. So too many authors really to name, but yes.
Nancy, when you're speaking to a bunch of Massachusetts libraries and librarians,
there's never too many books.
Yeah, and I will say Dennis Lehane is always a safe choice.
Oh, is he? Okay, because I love his storytelling and used to go to a writing workshop that he founded in Florida. So
yeah,
he's brilliant, and I study his work a lot.
He's a Massachusetts native, so we claim him.
He is. Yes, very much so. And he learned a lot of his storytelling, he says, in the bars of Boston, with his family. So that's it.
Speaking of Massachusetts natives, real quickly, Julie, any books you're reading that you might recommend to the audience?
Yeah, well, one I'm highly anticipating is Sarah Penner's The Amalfi Curse is coming out in May, I believe. She wrote The Lost Apothecary and the London Seance Society, and I'm very excited about that book coming out. A book I just finished, which I really loved, is also nonfiction. It was by Tracy Kidder, Rough Sleepers, which is about a medical van or medical team in Boston that drives the streets of Boston, caring and serving the homeless population. And it's right in the neighborhood where I live, in downtown Boston. Like the parks and the stoops and the things are the places in this book where unhoused people are living. They're called rough sleepers, is a term that they use for people who choose to sleep outside, even in rough weather. And it was a really personal story. It was about individuals. It was not about numbers and statistics. And it was really compelling. And I think being from Boston and walking through Boston Common every day, it was really meaningful to me to see these places and and just really a very personal story. All of the he focused in on a handful of unhoused people in Boston in particular and told their stories as people, and it was really beautiful. And then I'd say the best book I've read recently, hands down, is what was the name of it again? People of Means by by Nancy
I'm sitting there
Johnson.
waiting, like, well, can I get this book?
Yes, yes, it is.
Oh, is it
I
this
say
one?
that
Really?
one that book is
Oh,
so
okay.
good, and I say that with love for Nancy, but also it is such a good book. It really is. When you read a book by your friend, you hear it in their voice. I see pieces of Nancy in this book, just little tiny moments that I think are little bits of her life. But and now you've all gotten to meet Nancy a little bit, so maybe you'll see a little bit of those pieces in there. But it's such a wonderful read. I highly recommend
Thank
that you
you.
all
Now
run
you
out
see
and
why
buy
I
it.
love Julie and take her everywhere with me. But it's been wonderful. We didn't get to talk about writing and publishing, but it has been just the honor of my life to be on this journey with Julie, and to lift each other up in the tough times and to celebrate each other in the good moments too. So couldn't have asked for a better person to be on the journey with.
Yes, I agree so much that we were writing our books at the same time. We got agents around the same time. Our books published within like 4 or 5 weeks of each other, our debut novel. So we've been there kind of in lockstep the whole way together. And yeah, I'm really grateful too. I feel like your friendship has made this whole journey like it just elevated it for me. So
And I see some
So
people in the chat mentioning that they're buying the book. I just want to say thank you to everybody who's buying it and supporting. I so appreciate it. I really do. And I don't take that for granted.
Debbie loved the conversation and loves your friendship, wishes you both the best of luck. Denise
Thank you.
says, such a great interview. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your book. Belinda says, thank you, Nancy, for talking with us. Just bought the Kindle edition and added the audiobook, and she thanks you both. Nancy, Julie, what a conversation. And now that things have gotten going and we have to end, we have 4 questions in the Q&A box. So, but we are going to end here.
But send
That's
those
okay.
to me. I don't mind reaching out
Yep.
to people to answer them.
Here's my question to both of you to get you out of here. What are you working on now, if you can divulge? And where can people find you online and learn more about you?
Let's see. For me, I'm not working on a new book yet, but I'm working on ideas for a new book that I'll be sharing with my literary agent, and then we'll be pitching that to my editor at William Morrow, HarperCollins. I'm pretty sure it will also deal with issues of race and class, because that's really what I love to write about. That's what obsesses me. So I'm just trying to come up with the best ideas so that I can get a new contract and bring another book into the world for readers. You can find me on Instagram as Nancy J. Author there. You can find me on Facebook, Nancy Johnson Author.
And I have a book coming out next year. It's called The Forest Becomes Her. All of my books are very steeped in nature. They have elements of like environmentalism and climate themes weave through all of my books. And this is a book set in Concord, Massachusetts, for all those Massachusetts folks out there. And it has to do with deforestation. It's about 3 women who have very different relationships to a piece of land that's been deforested in Concord, and a housing development sprung up. And there's a little bit of a ghost story in there. And there's a lot of me in this story too. So I'm really excited to get this book out. I feel like it's the most personal, the most honest and true story that I've written yet. So that'll be coming out in May of 2026. And you can find me at Julie C. Dalton on Instagram and at Julie Carrick Dalton on Facebook. And I'd love to hear from all of you.
So folks, let's give Nancy and Julie a big virtual round of applause.
And I'd like to thank everybody too. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you. Thank the libraries, thank Wellesley Books, thank everybody. Thank you, Robert, for this invitation. This has been such a special occasion for me. Again, thank Julie for being my conversation partner, and thank all of you out there for tuning in.
And I'm going to take 15 seconds of personal privilege because I read the wrong bio when I introduced Nancy. And I neglected to mention that People magazine has named People of Means one of the most anticipated books of the year calling it beautifully crafted. And People of Means has also, as was mentioned, been recently featured in Women's World and Real Simple magazines. So it's getting a lot of positive buzz. It's only been out for a couple of weeks. I encourage everyone to go out and buy it. Please get it at Wellesley Books if you can, but really any independent bookstore would be wonderful. So thank you all so much. I hope everyone enjoyed this conversation, and look for the follow-up email with the recording in a few moments. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.